Hello and welcome to Earthbeat Visions, a history of the future sound of London. One of the good things about this coming out as a series is it allows for changes as things go along. Brian Dougans got in touch to give me a few fact corrections about the last video for Humanoids Global and some more information. So I learned that Jetstream Tokyo and Crybaby were actually recorded alongside Stack of Humanoid in the 1987 session that provided material for the Acido Amingo compilation, hence them all being relatively similar in style and construction. The Deep was actually originally begun by Brian, albeit as an acid track. He believes some of the original acid ideas can be found on the single, and those two new mixes on there do feature some unconventional 303 work. That might also explain why those mixes are much better than the album version. He also believes one of the reasons behind Morgan Khan's push to get Humanoid away from acid was due to the increasing controversy around the genre at the time, with the press going mad about acid house parties and drugs, and mainstream radio refusing to touch the style as a result. Apparently Khan was surprisingly fond of Sunshine and Brick, it reminding him of Cameo of all people. I mean, I can kind of hear it, if Cameo were white and British and Cabaret Voltaire fans. I said it was Brian who pushed for the track to be included on the album originally, and the youth programme that it was used as the theme for was called Behind the Beat. Humanoid's show in Hyde wasn't actually a one-off, and there was in fact a tour of bingo halls, often used for these kinds of shows, just mimed PAs with some samples dropped in live. The strangest show was at a bingo hall somewhere in the south of England where Humanoid performed at full volume to an audience of 3 old ladies who'd come in to play bingo. Brian described that as the most bizarre thing he'd ever been involved in. Oh, and what you're looking at on screen is the cover of Bacteria from a Baboon's Stomach. 37 years after release, the wider audience is finally seeing it. In this video I will be covering the 3 releases of late 1990 from A.S.T, Yunie and Mental Cube. Art Science Technology, A.S.T. A.S.T is the 9th release discussed in this series so far, but the first by Dougans and Cobain. They'd released music with Ian MacArthur and Garry had helped out with lyrics and vocals on Global, but this was the first release by the pair of them alone. We're fortunate to have plenty of interviews from the success of Papua New Guinea onwards, but this era of FSOL is still fairly vague. For a long time all we knew about the time between Brian's return to Glasgow and the release of A.S.T, when they'd started living and recording in London, comes from a few sentences in Garry's stories. At this point we'd split and had 2 separate studios, he age felt depleted after the messy ending of Stacker and hadn't written much. There had been intermittent problems with Pin's attitude on and off. Now there was no stopping the guy, the studio was in his bedroom and soon he began to conveniently thwart access to the new Jewel. He of course was rampant, playing and creating until dropping into bed a couple of feet away each night. Not the most auspicious start to a working partnership, but then interviews from the 90s often highlighted the tense working relationship between the two. But for the first time there's now a little more information about this era thanks to chatting with Brian. After recovering at his parents' home, Brian returned to his Manchester flat, but found himself without cash and without a job. He clearly decided that he wanted to do music as a living, and so, after going on the dole, he applied for the Prince's Trust for funding to set up his own studio. He received the Trust's Enterprise grant, and he and Garry used the money to set up a studio in his new West London home, coincidentally near Dollis Hill. The pair recorded a number of tracks in Brian's front room studio, including some by Mental Cube and a number of pieces later released on By Any Other Name. They even got a rapper involved on some tracks, although none of these have been released. Then disaster struck and the house was robbed, the pair losing much of their equipment as a result. Remembering a friend he'd met at Morgan Khan's dance music studio who'd offered to help in the past, he reconnected with him, and this was Tim Jones, who got the pair a studio in a dedicated studio block in Dollis Hill, not far from Brian's home, and although given executive producer credits on several early releases, Jones is incredibly overlooked and an unsung hero in the FSOL story, one without whom things might have been incredibly different. now having a secure home for all the kit, Brian was also gifted a huge bundle of vintage analogue gear by his father. The studio block was managed by one Nick Philpin, whose surname was quickly mangled into Philip Pin. Pin then became a name the band adopted as an alias, being used to refer to either of them in stories and credits pages over the coming decade. Another alias was Yage, who very quickly became a go-to name for the engineering credit given to most of the releases they put out. And so Brian Dougans and Garry Cobain were ready to release their first 12-inch. Despite the world building around the release, the A-side of A.S.T is fairly straightforward, utilising their samplers. The new jewel referenced in the quote earlier was an Akai S612. They threw together a bouncy breakbeat number that liberally sampled from the Stranglers' Something Better Change. It's far from the most auspicious career opening track, although the B-side featured a lot more interesting use of samples. The gang was completed by Mark McLean under the name Silo Rack, as he'd been thanked in the global liner notes. The Buggy G Riphead moniker wouldn't appear until a couple of releases later. The cover art by McLean and Brian's Glasgow friend John Goslin features a heavily filtered face with various computer generated shapes layered on top. Although crude in comparison with what will come in a few years' time, the overall composition and use of the human face feels very in line with classic FSOL album covers like Lifeforms and Dead Cities. The 3-track EP was released on Debut, a sub-label of Passion that had grown out of the 80s dance label Debut Edge Records and had had a huge hit with Candy Flip's cover of Strawberry Fields Forever. Another hookup from the Humanoid era, one of the many faces who'd appeared in Khan's studio was a guy called Ken, who made his money selling vinyl, and he recommended the Passion labels as a good place to release, so they became the first place the band tried when looking for a label. This started a 2-year relationship with Passion, who also owned Jumpin' and Pumpin', and also set out the EP format that would define the band's early work. The credits are different on the sleeve and labels. The back cover features the duo listed as B-Dog and Cobain, while the labels feature the formal credit, including Garry's birth surname spelt C-O-C-K-B-A-I-N, although still pronounced Cobain. Although the art science technology alias would never be returned to, everything else was in place for the release of the EP. From here, each release would contribute more to the construction of the EBV world that FSOL and their side projects continue to inhabit. In the grand scheme of the FSOL catalogue, A.S.T is a somewhat unremarkable track. The use of the guitar and organ from the intro to Something Better Change by the Stranglers is fairly unsubtle, enough to give the full band a co-writing credit, and the general bouncy breakbeat track feels somewhat slight. There are samples of crowd noise in there which lend it a very early 90s feel, and the few synth sounds used are fairly straightforward. Further listens do reveal some interesting elements, however. The track never stands still, instead continually breaking from the Stranglers sample to bring in new elements, most notably the midsection at 2:10, with spacey synths, a one-off piano chord, a brief bongo loop and a melancholic gated synth riff. This part in particular hints at the complexity the pair would bring to their music as they grew as producers. Another aspect that will be familiar to long-time fans introduced here is the appearance of recurring sounds. The tracks were often jammed in the studio, resulting in numerous alternate versions and related tracks. The synth bass in A.S.T features on the following track, Issa's Flow, while the gated synth middle reappears on Issa's Flow Vast Galaxy Remix, which gives the whole EP a nice connected feel. A.S.T has never been a personal favourite of mine, and its importance mostly comes from its position as the first official Dougans Cobain track, and the first release to have been recorded at Earthbeat. That said, it's quite a fun piece, and despite it sounding a world away from the FSOL sound that would develop, deep listening reveals many of their iconic production practices date right back to this early point. As a quick aside, I will only be referring to officially credited and occasionally widely discussed samples in this series. There are plenty of other places online one can find a list of uncleared samples used in their music. Issa's Flow. The B-side to A.S.T, figuratively at least, its actual position is A2. The track is an interesting hodgepodge of new sounds and recycled elements. It opens with the drums from Stacker Humanoid, immediately linking the Dougans Cobain project with Brian's solo work from the late 80s. Despite the drums, the track isn't acid house, instead it features organ and electric guitar samples in a very similar style to A.S.T. With a couple of exceptions, these early Alias 12-inch releases tend to be linked stylistically with tracks similar in sound released together. Between opening and closing organ and guitar sections, the track does get more unusual with a huge array of spacey sounds thrown through the samplers. This atmospheric section hints at the more psychedelic ambient work Brian and Garry are best known for, which is most unusual for the fact that they would largely avoid this sound for the next 12 months or so. The track closes with some brief gong sounds that would become more prominent on the Vast Galaxy remix and would recur many times throughout the band's catalogue in the years to come. Issa's Flow really does feel like a B-side, a brief, unusual experimental piece that's far from memorable, but one that has significance because of its early use of atmospheric sampling. Issa's Flow Vast Galaxy remix. Undoubtedly the highlight of the A.S.T EP, this track is not only a remix of Issa's Flow but also A.S.T itself, featuring 2 synth loops used in the latter. Once these synth parts are through, just over a minute into the track, things fall away into the more atmospheric territory hinted at on the original version. The drums are once again from Stacker Humanoid, but they spend most of the track rumbling away behind a huge array of spacey atmospheric samples. The one that will leap out to most FSOL fans is the collection of gong sounds that come from Kraftwerk's wonderfully titled Kling Klang. These gongs form the background for a collection of flute samples and numerous unidentified sounds in the piece that was eventually released in 2007 as Environment Gong on From the Archives Volume 1 and was used regularly throughout the band's 93 and 94 radio mixes and transmissions, at which point it was actually known internally as an amorphous androgynous track called Isus. It's quite remarkable that such a recognisable element of the FSOL sound dates back to their first ever release. Other samples used in the final 5 minutes of the track include sci-fi synth whooshes, female spoken word, and a saxophone riff also familiar from the Lifeforms era transmissions. In essence, this abstract sound collage is the template for the band's later sound, only with the stacker drum loop behind it. Issa's Flow Vast Galaxy remix is a remarkably bold piece of music for a group so early in their career, and features a sound they wouldn't return to for some years, with the next few releases focusing more heavily on straightforward dance music. A real favourite of the group's early independent years and a track worth seeking out for those who haven't explored this era in much depth.
I can see for more.
Yunie, I Can See for Miles. The second Dougans Cobain release is a bit of a weird one. For quite a few years, the 12-inch of I Can See for Miles was often annotated with not confirmed as an FSOL release on fan sites. On the surface this seems quite strange given that the writing and production credits are almost identical to those on A.S.T, released only a month or two before. The confusion, it seems, came from the fact that I Can See for Miles is a song in the conventional sense, with a female vocalist who may be the cover star. The general opinion at the time seemed to be that this was a track by a singer called Yunie, produced by Brian and Garry. Having spoken to Brian about this in more recent years, it appears the truth is halfway between the two. Yunie was the name of the overall project, but also the name of the singer. None of this is made clear on the sleeve, but then the band did always enjoy employing their imagination on the credits sections. The single is unusual in a few other ways. With just 2 tracks, the original version and a remix on the B-side, it runs contrary to the EP style format found on most of their early 12 inches. The release is a notable omission from the list of early singles from a press page that features in the Most Important Moments of a Life book, thus we don't even have a release date for the track. The track itself is a down-tempo, jazzy pop song that resembles almost nothing else in the Dougans Cobain catalogue other than maybe Crystals at a stretch, and it's an exceptionally rare example of an FSOL related release not to feature any credit for Yage. I Can See For Miles may be a somewhat forgotten entry in the band's catalogue, and the name was never used again, but it helped cement their relationship with debut and set the template for an ever-changing alias format which will continue over the following 2 years. Once again, the artwork is credited to Boogie as Silo Rack, and it's listed as being produced by Humanoid. I Can See For Miles. A jazzy mid-tempo pop song, I Can See For Miles sticks out like a sore thumb in the group's early releases. Built around breakbeats with soulful chords and trumpet, the backing track lacks the usual atmospheric touch that Brian and Garry brought to their music even at this point. The vocalist, also called Yunie, has a pleasant voice, and the lyrics are a mixture of fairly standard love song fare with some slightly spiritual imagery. It's quite a nice song really, and a sort of thing that with the right promotion could have been a chart hit at the time. BBC4 have relatively recently been repeating Top of the Pops episodes from 1990, and there are a number of similar sounding songs in the charts at the time. The track, however, has ended up fading into obscurity even within the FSOL fandom. I Can See For Miles, Astral Mix. A largely instrumental version of I Can See For Miles, the Astral Mix opens with a sparkly synth arpeggio not on the original, and appears in place of the trumpet samples. With the vocals reduced to a brief appearance in the middle, and the jazzy brass sections removed entirely, the Astral Mix will probably appeal to more FSOL fans than the original mix. The overall vibe is certainly closer to what people will be familiar with from the band, even if it feels somewhat sparse in places. Without the vocals, the verses lack much focus. The original made its way onto a couple of compilations, but this mix is only to be found on the 12-inch, making it one of the least known tracks in the band's catalogue. Mental Cube, Child of the Bass Generation. If the previous 2 singles were solid and well received, but ultimately set to languish in semi-obscurity, then everything changed with the debut Mental Cube release. Not only have the 2 opening tracks gone on to be classics of turn-of-the-decade dance music, but the Mental Cube name was the first Dougans Cobain alias to end up being reused. The name itself was one of Garry's inventions, inspired by imagery in the Stacker Humanoid video. Another aspect that ties the EP to later releases is its diversity. Both A.S.T and I Can See For Miles were fairly homogeneous, compiling tracks of a particular genre together, something that would happen on many other 12 inches of the era. While Child of the Bass Generation features 3 stylistically varied tracks, from the funky breaks of the title track to the bleak techno of Q. Credit-wise, things feature a shift here too. The Stacker-esque cover is Boogie's first classic, as well as the first to use the Riphead name. Humanoid is no longer present on the credits, and Yage is given a rare production role rather than being listed as an engineer. Garry still features his birth surname at this point. The band clearly hadn't decided on the final template that would go on to use for many years, but as with the music, everything here feels like a leap forward into more familiar territory. The record, and Q in particular, would go on to be huge in clubs, and Q was licensed to European labels the following year, and due to heavy demand, an updated version of the EP was reissued by FSOL Digital in 2020. The Mental Cube name would be used a few more times during the band's tenure on Passion Music. The final track, Dope Module, would become the name of an alias used on 2007's By Any Other Name. Child of the Bass Generation. The stories on the old EBV website, many later reprinted in the Ramblings of a Madman series of books, are difficult to navigate sometimes due to the number of aliases used. Yage, for instance, can refer to Brian or Garry or even Boogie. One such story is probably written from Garry's perspective. Yage here is described as feeling depleted after the messy end of Stacker, and from this it's possible to assume that Child of the Bass Generation started life as a Cobain track. But ultimately these stories are intentionally confusing and vague, and any conclusions must be met with a pinch of salt. We do know from numerous interviews that tracks would usually be started by one member before the other took over, eventually being passed back and forth until things were complete. Whoever it was that started on the track, the story here describes it as a load of rare grooves minced into bad form, which Brian then went on to help mix. We don't get much insight into the working process, so snippets like this are always fascinating. The track was one of a few recorded at Brian's home studio before the band got the Earthbeat studio. And it's become a fan favourite and one of their most enduring tracks from the group's formative years. It's absolutely nothing like their other tracks from 1990 or even 1991. Weird breaks, flutes, funky bass, organ and wah-wah guitar. It's much closer to what they go on to do during the A.S.T sessions. Indeed, it was drastically worked into the track Hot Knives, and even, to an extent, the 21st century incarnation of the Amorphous Androgynous. The track was done as a live recording, the pair jamming in the home studio. It was a brave track to use on the A-side of the first Mental Cube EP. Brian's flatmate had previously dismissed the track as way too slow, and only a cassette copy remained, which explains the weirdly compressed saturation on the bass frequencies. But the gamble paid off. If Garry remembers DJing the track to just one dancer in full 70s get-up, that dude was sent by God apparently, then time has been generous because it's frequently cited as a classic, even by those who aren't FSOL fans. It's been slightly overshadowed by Q on the EP's flip side, of course, but those who know, know. Q. Dedicated FSOL fans know to expect confusion. Things are often not what they seem, and track titles don't always correspond to what you might think. This is most obvious in the radical variations between album and single versions of Cascade, Lifeforms, My Kingdom and the like, but this began much earlier. Back in the Napster days, Q was one of my first downloads, maybe even the second track I grabbed after Stack of Humanoid. I loved it from first listen, which is unsurprising given how popular the track was back in '90 and the continuing interest up to this day. What I didn't know is that I downloaded the 4-minute 12 version which appears on Earthbeat. I later downloaded the original version running to 6 minutes 30, and being a child of the later 90s, the original felt way too slow for me, although that's how the track was intended. The version on the Child of the Bass Generation EP, which is the track we're discussing here, is an edit of the original version. Still with me? Whichever version you have, it's an undeniable bleep techno classic. On the Child EP's initial release, Q overshadowed the other two tracks and was quickly licensed out to Belgium's Buzz label and Flair Nash in France, 12 inches that go for more than £100 on Discogs. The track's enduring appeal never really abated, with a batch of dubious remixes commissioned by the Used and Abused label in 2011 and, to much demand, an FSOL digital reissue in 2020. Check any YouTube video of the song and you'll find countless people declaring their love for the track. One of the earliest tracks recorded at the Earthbeat studio started out with rhythm sections put down by Brian. Garry was responsible for lead melodic elements and many of the samples. Third time was the charm for Brian and Garry, and it's not hard to hear why. Excellent as they are, tracks like A.S.T and I Can See for Miles sound positively flimsy in comparison to the muscular melodic techno of Q. The final live mix of the piece went through possibly a touch too much compression, but this does give the track a punch that really gives it a certain energy. A wonderful track as long as you don't give yourself a headache trying to work out exactly which mix you have. Dope Module. With two bona fide classics before it, Dope Module rounds out the EP on a very weird note. A strange techno breakbeat hybrid recorded in Brian's home studio. The track samples brass, wah-wah guitar and orchestral stabs and blends them with a staggered drum programming and, for the first time, sampled vocals. The vocal sample feels almost like a novelty here. Discogs user Orbtastic describes the track as not sounding right at either 33 or 45, and the bizarre vocal is definitely a part of that. But in hindsight, it's the first example of a key element of the FSOL sound. The track's a bit of an obscurity, it's never appeared on any compilation albums, nor the 2020 reissue of the EP, and at 2 minutes it was unlikely to get much club or rave play. But fans coming to the track may notice some familiar sounds, most notably the ringing electric guitar and outro breakbeat, which were reused in From the Archives Volume 2's Head Kick, arguably a remix or alternate take of the same track. The 2007 compilation of unreleased pieces from this era by any other name features 4 tracks using Dope Module as an alias, and one of those, She's So Automatic, utilises the same guitar sample. Lastly, From the Archives Volume 5's Tiff Fetal features the same breakbeat, albeit sped up. Despite being a lesser known track, Dope Module spawned a large family. Mental Cube and Humanoid. Guru Josh Support, Empire Ballroom, London, 19th of December 1990. When FutureSoundOfLondon.com launched in full in late 2001, there was a huge amount of new information for fans to digest. Most of it's unusable now, even on the Wayback Machine, thanks to the lack of browser support for flash files. However, one of the most exciting areas was the shop page, which not only announced several forthcoming releases, but provided numerous pages of press for past releases. One of these pages included a flyer for a show at the Empire Ballroom on Leicester Square in London. The show is the only known date of the band appearing on stage, outside of the mimed Humanoid tour, and as such is a fascinating document. The gig found the band supporting Guru Josh, who had earlier in 1990 had a huge Europe-wide hit with the re-recording of Infinity. Undoubtedly a lucrative moneymaker for Brian and Garry, their support slot featured them in the roles of Mental Cube and Humanoid, acting as guest DJs and live sampling. One assumes this would have been a very primitive version of the kind of thing found on the Kiss FM test transmissions a couple of years later, with odd psychedelic sounds placed between the dance tracks from the era, but Brian remembers it more as simply Garry DJing while he stood by his side. The pair were placed on a rotating stage, meaning they were sometimes at the back and sometimes right by the crowd. Sounds like a bizarre and intriguing show, and it's a shame that there's no footage of it in existence. This would be the last time the Humanoid name would appear, other than for a stack of Humanoid reissues, for the best part of 30 years, and almost certainly the only live appearance for Mental Cube, a name that was clearly proving popular at the time. Sadly, even a Google search comes up with next to nothing about the show. Undoubtedly another aspect of FSOL's history lost to the winds of time. And that's it for this episode. Next time I will be discussing the early releases of 1991. The Pulse EPs, Aircut's Visual Attack, and Principles of Motion by Intelligent Communication. In the meantime, I'd love for you to leave a comment. Please let me know what you think of the music on these releases, and of course subscribe, like, share, get this video seen by as many people as possible, and I look forward to seeing you next time.